main things that I had talked about a couple weeks ago was that I wanted to hear that Xavier Townsend and Chase Soul, or at least a couple receivers, were really starting to make headway and really stand out from the crowd. And I can say that I've heard from multiple people, not just not just in other outlets, but just from other people that I've heard from, is that Xavier Townsend is kind of living up to I don't know if expectations is the right word because he hasn't been here, hasn't played yet, but of what maybe what a lot of people think that he can be is that he's definitely been a standout in spring ball, and that doesn't shock me. He's coming from a Power Five program and a good one in UCF. UCF is a good, respectable Power Five football program um, that I would expect. And he played a lot at UCF, caught a lot of passes, and touched the ball a lot at UCF. So it doesn't shock me that he's able to come in right away and make an impact. It's a different situation than when you have guys like Xavier Hutchinson coming in, or a Jaden Higgins, or an Isaiah Alston coming in, where it takes them a second to get kind of caught up to the speed of Power Five football because um, they're coming from a mid major, a G5 school, or an FCS school, or in case of Xavier Hutchinson, JUCO. Um, you know, that it's a big step up in competition and just the speed of the game from those levels up to Power Five football. So getting caught up and getting acquainted with the offense and all that is always a challenge. It's sometimes more of a challenge for others than it is for some people. Obviously, Jaden Higgins was, started right away. He played right away and played well right away. But you could tell, even though, towards the end of his first season at Iowa State, and then obviously into his second season, is when he really got comfortable in the offense. And you could tell that that's when that happened. It wasn't, and Jaden was able to play right away because he's so talented, and he was able to jump in and just kind of, run basic stuff and basically just get open essentially. And it worked pretty well for him. But you could tell once he really got a good grasp of the offense and got his feel for the game, that's when he took off and became, day two pick, maybe potential back into day one type player that eventually became Jaden Higgins. I But Xavier Townsend is coming from a Power Five program in which he played a bunch. He played a lot at UCF and he touched the ball a lot at UCF. And he came here. I've been hyped about it since he came here. I thought he was destined for a bigger school because I think he's got obvious athletic ability. I think he fits many types of modern offenses. I think he's a perfect fit for a lot of schools. But Iowa State did recruit Xavier out of high school. He was an Iowa State commit at one point, and then flipped to UCF. But he was also a teammate of Rocco Becht, so there's familiarity with the quarterback on the roster, the guy throwing him the football, obviously. Um, so you've got familiarity there. You've got familiar with the coaching staff, and certainly at least some familiarity with the offense. They would have shown him a little bit of it when he was in his recruiting process, and then obviously just being an opponent of Iowa State, you learn some of that stuff and kind of what Iowa State's trying to do, even if he wasn't studying Iowa State's offense as much. But it doesn't shock me that he was a natural, plug and play, impact player in the offense. I think that's exactly why Iowa State brought him in, is because he would be able to come in and start day one and be a great fit alongside Rocco and the rest of that offense. Couple other names I've been hearing. One was Brett Eskildson, who played a little bit towards the end of last year. It has apparently been very good in practice and starting to make good strides. So that's an interesting name since he was a true freshman last year. And then the other one is another true freshman from last year, which is Dominic Overby, which I think I have mentioned before. Um, I've heard that Dominic is also having a very nice spring practice, and I thought that he was a guy that would have a really good chance to take a big step forward in the spring and potentially contend for um, Iowa State's second spot across from, presumably Xavier Townsend. The other guy, obviously, was the transfer Chase Soul from Eastern Carolina. I haven't heard a lot about him. That doesn't necessarily mean anything. That doesn't mean he's not having a good spring. That doesn't mean he's not having a good spring. Doesn't mean anything. I have just not heard his name come up as much as I have other people's. Again, like I said, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. But we've heard Dominic Overby, we've heard Brad Eskildson, I've heard Xavier Townsend. A couple other guys that I've heard interesting things about or good things about was I've heard that Abu Sama has had a very nice spring. Not shocking. He's had two good springs the last two springs. Obviously, the key for him is that he needs to carry over his offseason momentum where he blows the staff, he blows everyone away with his ability and his explosiveness, and then carry that over in through the season where he can be, a 2020, be a 20 carry back that can consistently find the holes, be patient, and keep getting positive yards on runs that don't have a lot going for them, along with his explosiveness where he can just take one to the house real quick. So it's still a matter of consistency for Abu Sama. Um, it's still very early. I've heard right now he's getting the most carries in spring practice, but I would say loves to spread the ball. They spread the carries around. I'm sure Carson Hansen is getting plenty of carries. The other name that I heard, which I did bring up on this show, and I said I was very, very excited about him when we were talking about our freshman coming in, is running back River Peppers, out of I believe he's out of Kansas City area. I think he's out of Independence, maybe, or Lee Summit. Um, but River Peppers is a guy that I've heard has had a really nice spring, and if you're an early watcher of this show, you will have noted that I also predicted that I was pretty high on River Peppers coming out, because I just think he's got all sorts of ability. You can see a lot of Dave Montgomery in him, where he's just a super tough runner. He's got good wheels. He's got nice vision, nice patience. It doesn't surprise me to hear about him, um, having a really nice spring. Will he get carries in the fall? No idea. He's got at least three backs in front of him that are going to be competing for carries. Obviously, Abu Sama, Carson Hansen, then Dylan Lee is another guy. Iowa State can has shown clips of Dylan Lee from the spring, which sometimes means something, sometimes doesn't. Usually, if a guy's having a good spring, they make sure to get clips of him and put him on social media and all that. So I don't think Dylan Lee is like struggling this spring or anything like that. We've seen a few clips of him from the social media team at Iowa State. So, River Peppers still has at least three running backs in front of him. Yeah, I don't know what the status of like Aiden Flora is or anything like that, but they've still got Abu Sam and Carson Hansen, which I think they still see those two as kind of their two lead backs, with Lee and maybe Peppers, getting some kind of spell carries until unless someone's got a hot hand type of thing, which Iowa State has been known, when it comes to running backs, to kind of lean on the hot hand. If someone's having a really good game, they'll sit on him. We saw it a few different times last year with different running backs. We saw in the Baylor game, we saw Jalen Jackson have a really great game. And he took off, had I think a buck 24 or something like that. And then he ended up starting kind of falling off towards the season. But that was a game where he was having a really nice game and they just stuck with him and they ran him and ran him and ran him and ran him. And then you look at a guy like Carson Hansen, who came on later in the season. He started getting a lot more carries as he started getting better and getting more comfortable. But then you look at the Houston game, of this past year, where Abu Sama has that big run. He's getting carries because he's getting yardage. So there, Iowa State is not afraid to lean on hot hands. So if they put Dylan Lee in and he has a couple really nice carries, they'll keep him in the game and keep giving him the ball, and see what he can do. Iowa State likes to ride that hot hand, and it's certainly not to say that maybe River Peppers gets in there and gets a carry and does really nicely with it, and then keeps going and maybe earns some more carries. But I think right now it's still obviously way too early to predict what that carry share is going to look like. But Abu Sama and Carson Hansen, I would assume at this point in time, are still the favorites to be the two lead backs in Iowa State's offense, since they typically like to have two primaries and then some other secondary guys to spell, as needed or as matchup is, dictating that. So those are the main names I've heard. I haven't heard a lot on defense. I've seen 247 wrote an article about Marcus Neal, who I think is one of the guys that is absolutely ready to, potentially break out in the secondary and become one of those starters. We've seen a few different guys, pop up there. It's still early. You're only a couple weeks in, and if they decide to do a spring game, which I don't think is finalized or anything close to finalized right now, I'm not entirely sure. I think that can sometimes be a little bit of a last minute decision by the coaching staff. But it's still early and it's still just spring. So that's the important part to remember out of all this too, is that what happens this spring, just because someone didn't have an awesome spring or maybe they're dealing with injury or whatever it is, doesn't mean that they can't that they can't make an impact in fall camp or that they can't be ready to go in the fall. These are just guys that we've seen that, hey, they're having a really nice spring. And these are guys that we want to keep an eye on going into the summer and going into fall camp. That said, This year's a little bit different with the roster cuts now with the House settlement, and now you're going down to 105 players, which means that virtually every college roster right now is over that limit. There, I would guess few to none of them are at that 105 mark right now. And they don't need to be until the first game of the season. Um, Spring right now, I think is going to give a lot of guys. If there's a lot of guys that are battling at in the depth section of the depth chart, the third, fourth, fifth string kind of guys, if they after spring ball they feel like there's not going to be a lot of room to go, or they don't have much of a chance of playing this season because of those roster cuts, I wouldn't be shocked to see guys transfer early if they don't think that they are going to be able to get playing time. Because roster spots just across college football are going to be more limited than they were. So you want to get your name out. You're probably going to want to get your name out on the market as soon as you possibly can. Now, the transfer portal officially opens tomorrow morning. So I'm sure we will see a number of names come out all across college football tomorrow, just based on the first few weeks of practices where guys maybe have clearly slid back in the depth chart and they're just not there for snaps or whatever it is. We're going to see a lot of names come out tomorrow, I think, that will give us some clarity of maybe what positions are more solidified, which ones aren't, which guys are just not going to be involved in the game plan and whatever that is. So more news will be coming. I think this show next week we may have more to talk about in terms of roster attrition and who you're just losing just purely on the basis of guys transferring to get their name in there early, so that way they have the best shot of grabbing one of these limited roster spots that are available in college football. So that's all I've really got right now as far as I've heard from kind of practice nuggets. But we'll hear more as it goes on.